So as covered in the last video, I made this hold down piece for the drill press. One of the things that I noticed is I should probably try and make a little bit better versus just a prototype. That was in my head for a bit, and I drove past the metals supplier and found a sheet of aluminum. It's not as thick. I think this is closer to quarter inch to 3/8 versus the half inch people usually use for machinist plates. But this literally only is cranking down and not even enough to completely compress a layer of cork. And I'm not doing heavy machining. I don't have a mill. So this just has to hold things down less strong than for a milling machine. So I'm hoping this thick will work. And I got some crossbars, two different thicknesses. I think this is, well, this at least says it's 60/61. So I'm guessing that these may also be that. Probably same with this. Can't tell for sure. So I'm going to be crazy and clean up these edges and then line up stuff to do a bunch of holes in it to prep to be able to move the hold downs different locations and make a hold down plate. And then I figured these things, this one is slightly thinner than this by a little bit, so I'm not sure. That way I have choices for how thick I need it to be. I'm assuming that thick aluminum is overkill compared to that thick of wood, because this is how thick the wood was, and I would hope that the wood, even if it's solid wood, would bend slightly less than this thick of aluminum, but who knows? Aluminum is softer than wood in some alloys, so we'll see. But I got the thinner and the thicker, and that should be enough to play around. So this will be a version 2. We'll see if I make a version 3, how well this goes. So I start with filing the edges, because this was a rough cut plate, press cut, from what I could tell. And then I tried marking out the center and doing a grid. This, I recommend doing something like this, but I recommend trying to be a little more accurate. Mine grid was not perfect because the plate wasn't perfect. This would have been perfect on a CNC mill, which I don't have, because then you'd get exact holes, exact hole spacing. So I did the grid, drilled the holes for the center mounting plate, tapped those, as you see, and then put those in, figured out where to put that in the wood, because I was trying it with the 2x4, tried it, realized that I don't need it. Eventually I realized I don't need it that long, so I cut it and then fixed it. So when I had this wood piece, I just drilled random holes approximately and then put the side pieces in, and that was good, and I just drilled holes down through and attached. The one thing I did slightly different, I did slightly more measuring to put the holes, but it's still, these are 1/4-20 with the countersink heads. It's some of those machine screws, 1/4-20 by 1.5 inches. And as you saw, they're not long enough to go through the whole way in a 2x4, so I had to make that a little shorter. But that worked. The one thing I probably did wrong, probably should have put this grid on the other side, not on this side. And now, of course, I've already done it once. Do I really want to do it all again? Because that took a while and was annoying. For now, I'm going to drill holes, probably down through from this side, just because that way I can center them. So for this, there is some inherent friction associated with plywood that's not completely smooth. So if you put a piece of wood on there, it's going to want to not just slide completely. A lot of that friction goes away when you go to smooth aluminum. So what I was thinking, when I was playing around with some of the sanding before, one of my sanding belts broke. If I do 2 widths of that covers the majority of the surface. So I could theoretically cut and glue this down, and then that would give me the friction for where it touches the plate. And then I obviously would have the holes come up through this. It's 80 grit, so it'll give plenty of friction, and then try and put the cross braces in. And I figured out that I probably want 5/16 holes. So the all thread that I have is the 3/8 16. These must be the 5/16 bolts, because they're the size of that. So those are the 2 sizes of something long that I would have that I would probably use for the majority of work. And larger is better for hold downs sometimes, because that gives you more surface area on the threads and bigger threads and all that, and more strength in the bolts. But again, I can't crank it very hard because I'm using wood. If you're using metal, it'll resist tight forces a lot better than wood. Wood will dent and then your project sucks. Now I get to drill out all 60 of the holes and try and get them on the spots. Which again, CNC mill, this would have been great. Or even just spending the money instead of going this route and buying a pre-cut plate on Amazon. That's almost cost effective to do it that way. And yeah, just drilling lots and lots of holes. I was just trying to do it myself because, you know, it's a project, right? I like projects. I had to move this around a couple times because it wouldn't fit on the board and based on where the drill goes. But eventually I got it all sorted. It took a while because 60 holes and making sure it's all good. There I tried to do some countersinking, which I'm going to have to redo again later, but that's fine. Here, going through the final holes. Yay, done with the holes. Now countersink all of them. And now put it on the board and let's see how it goes. It looks like it's going to work. So that's good. Even the bolts and nuts all fit. Yay. I didn't go too close to the center section, one, because there's the 2x4 in there, and also, theoretically, stuff's going to be that big, so probably are not going to have a need to go right across there, and if you do, you can always shift it slightly, and then there'll be other holes to deal with. And here's one problem that I am going to run into. I tried to get these as close as possible squared on the grid. However, this was done manually, not with a CNC, so manually has more inherent errors. Most of these are straight. You can see if I line that up on the centers. This one's in the center, this one's in the center, this one is not, that one's in the center. So centers, mostly there, one is off, one is the slightly the other way. So, and I alternated on the grid versus every hole because these are the 5/16 18 size holes, and that way I left space. If I ever decide to do the larger ones, I could put larger ones in between on the other grid spots, or 1/4 or there's options. And I could always, if I decide that hey, I need a 3/8 in one of these spots, I could always just drill one of these bigger too. That's not a possibility. Because these holes can be slightly off, I think I'm going to make these larger so that this floats a little bit. So the bolt would come up through and screw in tight on the bottom so it would hold it in place, and then have enough of a larger hole here that this will float back and forth in case. Similar to what I did here, some of these are not exactly square for the threads because aluminum will let you do that. Steel will too, I suppose, but my threading is not the best for this. But that's okay, it's not super precision, it's just for woodworking. So as long as I can get a bolt up and I can get it in a hole and tighten a nut, we're good. It's not like this has to fit a matching plate of some sort. And I'm hoping, since these should be equal grids, that if I have it such that it's long enough for this long section, for example, this long set of holes, then I would just have to shift it, theoretically, for the other set of holes, and then shift it back for that holes. That hole's not supposed to be there. Because I had dots cross-hatching the whole way across, I wasn't paying attention after I had moved the thing around and drilled an extra. But that's okay, we'll just ignore that one. Now try and get the cross pieces marked and lined up, and then drill the holes for that. Here, I needed to be more careful of where some of the holes went, but it eventually worked. I also figured out it's side dependent. Is it sad to say that went about as I expected? You can see that these were not necessarily in a straight line. Neither are these. It matches up mostly on the one that I try and align it with, but it doesn't really match up for the others. However, the other thing I was thinking is, if these were not just circles, but slightly more of a slot than a circle, I would have more wiggle room going back and forth, because for the most part, they are in line this way. So if that hole is lined up there, that hole is lined up in this direction the whole way across pretty much. The 3/8 width of the hole lines up in this direction along the bar, but it's not necessarily in this direction on the bar. So if I was able to put a 3/8 inch slot slightly wider, and I'm assuming that that's not going to cause too many problems, that's not something you can do on a drill press. But I do have a lathe. And you may say, well, you're crazy. You can't put that in there and make a slot. I have a milling attachment for this lathe. Now granted, up until this week, I did not have the proper tools to go with it, meaning I had this, which is the part that goes through the chuck section, and I did not have any bits that would fit into here. However, I got a replacement that would replace this piece and has the same MT2 taper and the same threads as this. So theoretically, this part would screw into here, and then this is an MT2 32 chuck that you can put collets in, and I got the whole set of ER32 collets, and I got some high-speed steel bits. So I don't know if this is going to work, but I do now have this. So I think what I can do, there is a 3/8, which I think these are 3/8 holes.
So there's a 3/8 bit and a 3/8 collet. So I should be able to put the 3/8 bit and the 3/8 collet in the chuck, this in there, and try and do.
So I decided not to wait for the other tooling to try and use the lathe for that. So I just marked the other bar the same way I did the first one, but tried to be more careful, and then drilled it more carefully, and that all worked out great. Notice it also says bottom on that bar. I realized that based on the way the hole pattern is, it's direction dependent. And then I tapped all 60 holes. I did not record that all. I didn't figure anybody was going to want to see that. But there, those are all tapped. And now I'm putting those bolts in and the test piece, and it worked.
That's how it's supposed to work. I still might need to widen some of the holes, but I also figured out that, as always when you're drilling things, if you drill in one direction versus the other and you flip something vertical, or I should say flip it so that the bottom is now the top, if what you're connecting it to is not perfectly uniform, you won't get a match. So having this upside down, which is the way I had clamped it, tends to make the drilling a little bit easier, or I should say the holes line up a little bit easier for the first one. The second one I did, I was a bit more careful, and those lined up pretty much the whole way across. It took me 3 tries to set it up, but that one drilled better. And this is how it's supposed to work. So we have the bottom has the 2x4 that's mounted to the aluminum plate, and that 2x4 would then go into the vise, and that holds it either in this vise or in the cross-slide vise on the drill press. And ideally, this would be a flat top. It was designed with the idea of having it be a flat top, not a slanted. But this was the piece I just had laying around to test it against, and that has a slant. So this is not designed for this, and so this would not hold very well at all. It's designed to do flat, like I was doing with the jewelry boxes before when I was using the Forstner bit. Otherwise, I think it's going to work. Both pieces match up. I do probably have to cut off the ends. This should work. This will let me get lots of flexibility. It should hold down good. I want to put something on here to have it not slide. I'm not sure what the best way for that is. I still have to figure that out. Still have to figure out if I'm just going to put the cork underneath these, and I'm not sure if I'm going to use the center holes or not ever, but if I have something narrow, I might want to just have it nearby. Like if I have something just going across this way, being able to clamp it closer would tend to have better hold down than way at the end. And once I figure out if I'm doing cork or sandpaper or what on these surfaces to help with the hold down, I can do that. And I don't know if I'm going to just try and use the sandpaper I showed before, or if I'm going to get the sticky stuff, but yeah, it's cool. I think this is as close to done as I think it needs to be for it to be a good version 2. Again, the rest of it, you just pick what you want to put for causing friction and you go with it. So we'll see.